It's Sleeping in Trees, the audiobook. Chapter 7, Inconvenient Shrub. The neighbors who owned the house at the corner on Vista Lane were less than friendly. We rarely saw the father, a doctor, and when we did, he would usually dismiss us with an ugly snarl. Let's just say that his bedside manner left much to be desired. His wife was even worse. I pondered this neighbor's poor attitude and surly demeanor, and found it all hard to comprehend. After all, we always were taught to wave and say hello to our neighbors. My mom simply said it was a good practice to be neighborly, so we just went along with the program. It just made sense. Further, in our view, what neighbor would not want to be on good terms with a crew of 10 active and ever-present neighborhood boys who tended to wander around in a pack? One could imagine some downside to unprovoked displays of dismissive rudeness. I believe one new neighbor grasped well the street smarts of at least acknowledging the crew through an occasional hello or other friendly greeting. This man, a banker from the deep South, built a bright white Southern colonial right down the street from Little Billy, replete with large and impressive columns adorning the long front porch. We envisioned mint juleps served up while ladies and gentlemen in summer whites sipped away between the clicks of their croquet mallets. He was a large, jovial man, and his wife a statuesque Southern belle with the most syrupy of Southern accents. Both seemed to make a concerted effort to engage with our young crew whenever we might be milling about in front of their house. A form of insurance, perhaps, but they would painfully learn that this particular policy was lacking in some coverages. Months passed without incident until one dark evening when Lobster was doing a Bufo Marinus sweep in Cricket's front yard. He took down 2 massive specimens. For some unexplained reason, his best plan for discarding the corpses was one in the gregarious banker's mailbox and another draped over the brass handle of his front door. They were out of town during the act, and upon return, decomposing corpses, combined with dried, bloody drippings, produced a repulsive display requiring an epic cleanup. Somehow, Lobster was pinched for the act, and I believe, in reparation, a newly painted front door was required the next Sunday afternoon. The banking family's Southern charm seemed to be offered up with a bit less enthusiasm in the years that followed. Back to the rude doctor. My most distinct memory of the family was a birthday party for one of their 2 daughters. The oldest was named Abby. Our mothers were not on speaking terms, so it was strange that I was even invited to her birthday in the first place. She was 12 at the time, and I was a few years younger. Given that I had 2 older brothers, it appeared that when her mother worked up the guest list, she had written down the wrong brown boy's name. Dressed like a princess, with her doting mother hovering around, it was truly an odd affair. I spent most of the time thinking about what other things I could be doing that were actually fun. I did my best to persevere and tolerate the incredibly boring event while snacking on bagels and lox. We played pin the tail on the donkey. There was cake and ice cream, of course, but in all, the party was a bust and did little to enhance my dour view of the family who lived in the house on the corner. What they lacked in neighborliness, they made up for in landscaping. In a world of bland Florida scrub, they busted out with the most outrageous display of foliage. Their yard became, over time, a veritable jungle. It was a subtropical oasis with large palms, ferns, hibiscus, and gardenias lining the carefully sculptured walkways. No more room for shrubs? Let's have grass, broad carpets of it. And oh yes, a koi pond here, a rock garden there. They truly went over the top. There were few boundaries and, in those days, fewer standards in a neighborhood like ours. Covenants developed and enforced by modern homeowner associations were but a vague concept in South Florida in the 1960s. The nasty neighbor's jungle grew and grew. Before long, because my street curved around at the end of their compound, a shrub began to impede the view of cars rounding the corner. At first, the neighbors just dealt with it, but before long, the growing bush became a problem. It stood right at the apex of the curve inside their yard and presented a serious visual impairment. It became inconvenient. They were repeatedly approached with diplomacy and presented with the problem. The shrub was blinding drivers as they rounded the turn. It was a dangerous menace and would certainly cause a bad accident. This was inevitable. The grumpy doctor would always minimize the issue and defer to his professional landscaper. He would stride around the yard and inspect every bush and walkway with a discerning eye. In the end, the offending shrub continued to grow in size and obstruction. On my way over to Dinkle's one morning, I bumped into Butler in front of Dork's house. I laid out the issue of the shrub and the offensive neighbor. He'd had unpleasant dealings with his family as well, and was quite motivated to help in managing any issues. I suggested we take my machete one night and just chop down the shrub and throw it in the koi pond. He strongly discouraged this approach as too uninspired, crude, and unsophisticated. Butler was a young intellectual, a man of science, or so he held himself out to be. Rather than attack a problem with a messy solution, he preferred one more creative and refined. Hacking down the shrub would likely stir up a conflagration in the neighborhood that neither one of us would find desirable, especially him. He already resided at the top of the short list of neighborhood delinquents. We discussed how, in his studies of horticulture, he had recently learned that most shrubs are nourished not through their limbs, but instead through the outer layer of bark that covers them. In fact, he pointed out, if the bark of a tree or shrub is severed in a certain way, the nourishment could no longer flow up from the roots to the branches, and the shrub would expire. Late one evening, when the nasty neighbors had turned in for the night, Butler and I crept, knives in hand, into their dark compound and quietly approached the shrub. It was located at the far corner of their yard, so cars that passed illuminated it completely with their headlights. We were exposed, so we had to work fast. Down we furrowed to the belly of the beast and set to work with our blades. Butler's analysis suggested we had to carve a full 6-inch tall swath of bark away from the entire circumference of the shrub. This was a chore, especially in the black of night, and knowing that any passing car could put a bright spotlight on our malfeasance. As we carved, we listened for the sound of tires rolling down the road toward us. It was hot and humid down there under that bush and not an easy task. Luck was with us, and we only had to scamper once out from under the shrub and into the tropical undergrowth as a car rounded the corner. Conveniently, we both needed to pee at that very moment, and the koi pond was the logical place to answer nature's call. We were soon back to the assault. Before long, the base had been denuded so no nutrients could pass along its outer dermis and provide the nourishment it needed to thrive. As Butler assured, its color soon changed from green to brown, and it died. As often is the case, the perp returns to the scene of the crime. I pedaled past the nasty neighbor's corner in the weeks following the act. On more than one occasion, I noticed the landscaper in the yard with the surly doctor puzzling over the struggling shrub in an attempt to discern why it was in decline. The next tale combines circus, hucksterism, and deceptive marketing practices with the age-old lure of summer camp adventures, without most of the adventures. It's Chapter 8, and it's called The Peddler.